in conjunction with a Node Express server. React is a front-end library developed by Facebook, it was released a while ago, but it didn't really become popular until around 2015. And it became mainstream in the last 2 years, I would say. So a lot of the work I do professionally now is React, whereas it used to be Angular. I'm guessing you have heard of Angular. Has anyone here heard of Angular? Yeah. So that was where the bulk of my professional work was focused on for about 2 years. And then React came in and just sort of took that over. And so now React is where I do all my front-end client-side work in conjunction with something called Redux. And that's a state management library often used with React, although it doesn't have to be. So today what I'm going to do is just create a very, very simple React project from the ground up, explain the mechanics behind it, the organization, how things are put together. We'll create a very simple sort of event manager, a list of events around campus, deploy it to my system called Turbo, which is this is my startup. So this is what I built about a year ago, where you can deploy infinitely scalable applications that are currently only for Node Express. It's kind of like Heroku, but I think even better because there's a lot of reasons that I don't want to get into right now. But this is basically an alternative to Heroku. So we're going to deploy on here, and that's it. So to get started, you're going to need to install these libraries globally. Even a step before that, if you don't have Node installed, you're going to need Node. So install the LTS version here. Oh, wow, they just stepped it up recently, too. I think I'm still on like 8 something. Let me just double check. Yeah, I'm still on 8. It should be fine. Okay, I'll download the LTS later. But install Node, download the LTS. Should take about a minute or two. And then once you've installed Node, you're going to have what's called the NPM, which is the Node Package Manager, which is your package manager. It's kind of like pip for Python. Does anyone here have Python experience? Okay, so NPM is a lot like pip for Node or JavaScript. So we're using NPM to install these libraries, Gulp, Webpack CLI, and the Turbo CLI. If you're running Windows, you do not need the sudo. So in fact, it won't even work with the sudo. So just run npm install. If you're running Linux or Mac OS, the sudo I think is actually necessary. So go ahead and make sure you have that. And once you have this is enough to make sure to get started on a simple project. So I'm going to get rid of all this. I'm seeding to my desktop where I'm going to do this project, but you guys can do it wherever you do your normal work. I'm going to check my versions. So I have Node that, npm that, and Turbo CLI. This is the current version of the Turbo CLI that is on the npm system. So make sure you have that. Okay. And let's create a project. So the project is going to be a simple list of events around the Georgetown campus. So we'll call it like Hoya events, something like that. And it'll just be a very basic sort of web app showing upcoming events. Okay. So the Turbo CLI is called a scaffolding engine or a generator, which creates pre-configured projects out of the box, so you don't have to install everything from the bottom up. So we're using the Turbo CLI, amongst other things, that's what it is. So we're using the Turbo CLI to create a Node Express project in conjunction with a React project. Generators are very popular. So another example would be the Express generator, which gives you just the Node Express. Create React app is a generator, which gives you just the React side. The Turbo CLI sort of combines those two. Okay, so the Turbo CLI, we're going to do Turbo, new, and then Hoya's events. Hoya events, let's go with that. And that creates this directory, Hoya events, wherever you're doing your work. So I'm going to open that up in my text editor. In this case, Atom. And what we have here is a very basic Node Express application with a few configuration options pre-built in so that you don't have to install everything from the bottom up. Those configuration options, the ones that matter right now, are the templating engine, which is called Mustache, That's the one that I like to use. Other options are Handlebars, Jade, Hogan.js. Those are all pretty good options. They're all kind of the same. So I'm using Mustache, and that's why it says index.mustache right here. That's really just an HTML page, so you can look at it that way. You should be good to go. A couple other options are the static asset directory. That's where you store your CSS, images, PDF, whatever. And yeah, that's it. And the app.js is where everything is initially configured. So here, all the way on top, if you look at line 3 on my side, actually, I'll just revert it back to the way it was before. Line 4, that's the Express instantiation. That's where you create the Express app. All this commented out code, don't worry about. This is just more special features that we're not going to use today. And we have two what's called routes, which handles request response routing. And we have an API route and an index route. We're not going to use the API route, so we're really stripping this down to the bare minimum. And the index route is the one that handles incoming requests for the home page. Okay, that's pretty simple. What's important to understand right now is that this is just a pure Node Express project. React has nothing to do with this. Given that it's Node Express, what we have to do is cd into it. So Hoya events. So I'm cding into it right now, changing directory into it. And I have to install the dependencies. Those dependencies are currently listed in the package.json inside the dependencies, obviously. Okay? So to install these dependencies, all you got to do is npm install. And it'll go through that list of dependencies in the package.json and just download and install each one. And that's how it's done in a Node Express environment. And really just a Node project. Express has nothing to do with this part. So right now it's installing the dependencies as specified inside the package.json. So it's just going through this list and installing each one. This normally takes a couple seconds. And once that's done, which it now is, we have enough to run the project. Okay, so we want to run the local server, which is called the dev server, which will run the server of this project on your local machine. So we can do that by running turbo dev server. And this gives you a local server on port 3000. Okay, so we can just head over to localhost 3000, make sure it works. And you should see this, and we're good to go. Okay, and this is your web application right now. What you're currently looking at is the index.mustache file, which again is just an HTML template. And it's routed through the index.js file inside the routes directory. And right now, that's how the Node Express portion of this project is organized. Okay. So again, this is not React, but it's important to understand how this works. So I'm going to go back and turn off the server, which is Control-C. And now the server is off. Okay. So far, so good? Everyone follow along?
I downloaded Turbo when I went into the desktop directory and tried to create a new Turbo. Just like no Turbo, no such file directory.
Oh, try the following then: Turbo version like this, and you should see a number like that pop out. If that doesn't happen, that means the installation did not work.
Like it works on my home directory. Mm-hmm. When I go into my desktop directory, that doesn't work.
What does it give you?
No such file or directory. But if I cd out into the home directory and the Turbo version, it works fine.
And then you get that number? Okay. Well, then just try it in the home directory for now. And then we can just delete the project later. This is just a sample project. So, okay, where were we? So again, just to reiterate, this is just a pure Node Express project. It's just a server. So now what we want to do is install the React code base, again, using the generator. Okay. So the next thing we want to do inside the root directory of the project is turbo extend React. Now, before I press enter, let me explain what's going to happen here. It is going to install a React source code base in conjunction with a Redux code base inside this project and configure everything to work. So there's a lot going on there. Once it's done, we'll step through the organization, and I'll explain how the pieces work and what you need to know for the early stages. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so it's currently installing the React/Redux codebase. as well as the necessary dependencies. So right there, it's installing those dependencies which are required to run the code base. It is also doing what's called building the code base right now. So that's currently happening. Well, actually, it just gave me some warnings, but it's going to build the code base in a second. And then once that's confirmed, we can rerun the dev server and make sure everything still works. And then once we confirm that, I'll step through the organization and I'll show you how the pieces work together. Okay? So this is the build process. All right, cool. So once you see that confirmation message, what that means is the code base has been installed, built, and then compiled. So now we can go back to the dev server and just make sure everything still works. So head over to localhost 3000. It should look the same. But what's important to recognize here is that we are now running a React code base, as indicated by this little marker right here, which is the Chrome React plugin. So that means everything was successfully transitioned over to React and Redux. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the server. Now let's step through all that. So the React code is located inside this SRC directory, which is the sort of the standard project architecture. And inside here is where all the React and the Redux code is currently situated. We're not going to touch Redux, so there's a lot of stuff here you don't even really need to worry about. Right now, the two things you do need to worry about are this index.js file and this components directory. Those are the two things that matter for tonight's demo. Okay? The thing to understand about React is the following. You write your React code typically inside this SRC directory, more typically inside that components directory, and that React code is JavaScript or JSX, depending on who you talk to. So that's where you write the code. What then happens next is the code is compiled, and then the built version is what executes in the browser. It's very important to understand that distinction. So we have to compile the code. We got to build the code, and then the built code is what actually runs. The code itself is it's JavaScript, right? So it's executed in a browser, which is going to be the index.js file, index.mustache file, excuse me. So if you open this up, down here, lines 14 and 15, where I entered those spaces, is where your compiled React code shows up. Okay, that's the important thing to understand. So it's not like you write code and then that code automatically runs. It has to compile into that and then run. Make sense? Then that compilation process happens through, in this case, two areas, Webpack and Gulp. Okay? So if you look at your Webpack config file all the way down there, you guys see that in the lower left corner? If you open that up, you don't have to understand all this, but what matters is line 8. You'll see that's a direct reference to the index of the React source code. You see that src index.js? And then that's called entry, line 7. It's the entry point. And then the output is over here in the public dist directory under the bundle directory. So if you go to public dist, you'll see bundle. And then you'll see that's your bundled React code or your compiled code. So all your code ultimately ends up over there. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, why is that? Like, why this seems very roundabout? It seems very convoluted, and it is. It's not, it's not immediately intuitive. The reason is because if you look at the index.js file inside the SRC, I'm writing JavaScript here in a format called ES6 JavaScript or ECMAScript JavaScript, ES6 or ECMAScript 2015, which is a slightly more modern version of JavaScript that many browsers may not be built for, right? So a lot of older browsers, and by older I mean like even as early as like 2 years ago, right? They cannot run ES6 code, right? So you have to recompile the code into what's called ES5, sort of the old school JavaScript, the conventional JavaScript. So if you want to write in ES6, for the most part, you have to recompile that code into ES5 so that it has wide-scale browser compatibility. That's how that works. In conjunction with that, I'm using what's called JSX. So these lines are ES6 JavaScript, but this right here is called JSX. And JSX is a variation of JavaScript that makes it easier to write sort of HTML directly inside your JavaScript. And that also has to be compiled into just regular ES5 because JSX is a very unconventional format. It really wouldn't be widespread in use if not for React. Okay. Okay, so there's a lot like right off the bat. So it kind of requires a different way of thinking of how your code is organized. React itself revolves around what's called components. You can think of components as sort of building blocks, or like I like to think of them as Lego pieces, like Lego pieces that you put together to create your UI. Okay, so a component might be like, I'll just show you an actual example. On my website, which is all React, this is just a bunch of components thrown together, right? And the components can be reused in other pages. So this top blue section right here, that's its own component, which I call the nav bar, right? And if I go to any other page, you're going to see the same component. Make sense? And inside that page, I'm reusing that component within the React source code. That's how components work. For the time being, at the early stages, you can think of components as like your own custom HTML tags, and that's a fairly close approximation for now. It's like a very, very sophisticated HTML tag as a component. So really, the idea behind React is you're building out a series of components, a handful of components, and then you're using them to build your UI. That's how you think about React. And then within those components, you have to pass data around. That's the thought process behind a React application. Okay, and that's how you want to think of it. And then once you do that, you compile the code, and then you reload your UI. Let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing, if you look at our index.js right here, we have a component called intro. Don't worry about provider. In fact, let's just get rid of the provider because it's going to get in the way. So just get rid of it. The intro component is the component we're currently looking at when we open up our code right here. That's the intro component. Okay? And you can confirm that literally by looking at the intro component right here. You'll see welcome to Turbo. You're currently looking at this, that, and the other, right? You can just see the HTML, right? So let's get rid of that, obviously, because we want to build our own UI, right? So let's go ahead and head over to the src directory and then the components directory. And then let's create our own components and then build out our own UI, okay? So now we're building our own like Lego pieces, and then we're going to use our own Lego pieces. So we want to create a home component like that. Make sure you CD back to the root level because that's where you want to be to run your scripts, okay? And then opening up the home component in here, obviously it's empty, we just created it. So we want to import React and then the component class from the React library. So here I'm importing the React module as well as the component submodule of the React library. I'm going to create a JavaScript class called home. This is going to be a subclass of component. That's what the extends means. So I'm subclassing the component. And then every React component has a series of functions you can override, a handful, but there's only one function that you have to override, and that's the render function. So right here, we're overriding a function called render, and that's a rule. This will break if we don't do that. And inside the render function is where we define the actual visual content of the component, right? The actual HTML content, or technically the JSX. So here, if I do, now we just write HTML code. This is the home component. Okay. I made a small mistake. I'm sorry. You have to return. This requires a return. And then the return is where you define the JSX. So, given the thousands of times I've done this, I still make that mistake time to time. Okay, so within the return block, you can kind of see what goes on, right? That's where you define the visual structure of your component, right? And then last but not least, we have to export this component so we can use it within other components. So we do export default and then home. And that is a full component now. That is a React component, okay? So I'm just gonna add some extra lines here. So we have defined visually the structure of this component. So now what we want to do is head back to our index.js right here, which is oftentimes referred to as the entry point. And here we want to import the home component from the appropriate directory. And now we want to render our home component, which, like I said earlier, it's kind of like a custom HTML tag. So you see how I'm just using it kind of like an HTML tag?
Which index is this?
The one inside the src directory. So right here, all the way on top. Make sense? And that's oftentimes referred to as your entry point. Now, an entry point should be relatively light like this. So typically your entry point doesn't have like a million components jumbled inside. You wouldn't normally see that. You would see one component like home, and then the home component would have a bunch of stuff showing inside of that. That's how it's more typically architected, okay? So now don't forget, this code has to be compiled. So we go back to our terminal and we run npm run build, and that will recompile the code. It will do all that stuff that Webpack instructed. It will go into the index, take all the code, convert it into ES5. You should see green lines like this. The gulp is doing some extra stuff I'll explain later. Now that it's done, our code has been rebuilt. So we can rerun the server, Hoya events, turbo dev server. And if properly constructed, we should now see our home component rather than the default. You guys see that? This is the home component. And that's the idea behind sort of the React workflow. Like that, this workflow is something you want to get used to. I mean, something you have to get used to if you want to do React development. And this is sort of the process. Okay? So within the home component is where I can start building out the actual UI of the application. So this is called Hoya events, right? So on top, let's just list the name of the project. Welcome to Hoya events. You good to go? Any questions? All right. So once you start building out the UI, like I'm doing on line 8, it should be fairly comfortable. It's just HTML for the most part. It's technically not HTML. It's something called JSX. But JSX is really just a close version of HTML with a few extra rules that you just have to remember. So it's very close. It's like a 90% approximation of HTML. So if you already know HTML, you mostly know JSX. You just have to remember a few subtle exceptions, and that's it. Okay. Now, as you can see, if I keep the dev server running and reload the page, it's not going to change, right? Because why? It needs to be recompiled. Now, as you can see, this can become a very onerous after a while, right? Like if you're recompiling every single change, this can kind of slow you down, right? So what you want to do is run a development script that watches your files and recompiles for you automatically every time you make a change, okay? So in this case, that development script is npm run dev. Notice how I have that in a separate terminal window tab, so I can just keep that running in the background and then go back to my actual development flow and just get back to work. That makes sense? So I'm going to run npm run dev, which is just going to watch the files and recompile every time I save a change. Okay? So I just leave this running now, and then I go back to my main terminal shell, and then here it should now say welcome to Hoya events. But now it's being watched by the development script. So I can just get to work now and it'll recompile. Okay? So if I give this a class name, so here's one of the JSX rules right off the bat. On line 7 in HTML, you would just say class equals container, which is a bootstrap class. But here in JSX, you have to use class name with the camel casing because class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, or at least in the S6 JavaScript. So you can't just use class. It'll crash. Well, it used to crash it. Now it just throws a warning. But this compiles to just class when it's all said and done. So if you actually look at if you actually inspect the output, look at what you see over here. You see that? It says class, not class name, because it compiles it back down to ES5. That's how it works. Make sense? Now that it's watching the files, we can just sort of work as we normally would expect. So here, let's create another section called upcoming events. And then let's create an unordered list. And let's just create a few sample events. So does everyone here have like a cursory knowledge of HTML? Yeah, okay. HTML is pretty simple, right? Most people should have seen that by now, I would imagine. So. But feel free to just stop me if you don't know. That's what we're here for. So let's see, let's try H5. Coding workshop, November 1, 2018. Come learn how to create React applications. Okay, so I hammered in some stuff right now, and I'm not going to recompile it because the watch flag should be doing that automatically. Okay, so by now you should be sort of falling into sort of a comfort zone, like, oh yeah, HTML, like I've seen this before. Like that's the idea behind JSX, is that you want to be sort of in a comfort zone while you're writing React code. Okay, so here I'm just creating a very simple unordered list. Upcoming events, header 3 tag. So if I just reload the page, you'll see that right there. And just here's the code. I'm going to add one more, or maybe two more events. So Halloween dance. Bring your best costume. And job fair. Get a job. All right, so a couple simple, very straightforward stuff. And then if you reload that, it should be good to go. How's that looking on your end? Getting it to work, Derek?
Can you repeat the
Yeah, sure. So in a separate terminal, in a separate tab in the terminal, right? Make sure you're in the home directory like that, right? And then you do npm run dev. and that will run the development script, which is simply just watching your files to make sure every time you make a change in your files, it'll rerun the build script.
Like if I have an HTML or like I don't do a div or something.
Excellent point. That's a very good point, Mr. Undine. So here, JSX is a lot like HTML with one major exception. It is very unforgiving with mistakes. So whereas HTML, like you can kind of mess up a tag and it'll just run it fine. JSX is like, no, you gotta fix that. So for example, you see right here on line 14, if I mistakenly do that, which I do all the time, right? Like I didn't close the tag, I just reopened a new one, right? I now have 2 unclosed tags. Does that make sense? Now the watch flag over here will stop you right there. So this is another reason why you want to run the development script all the time, because it'll catch you right there, and it'll say you need to fix that on line 15. You see that? It tells you where it messed up, and it even gives you some indication in the console where you messed up, and then you find it and then you fix it. If you end up doing a lot of React, get very used to this. This will happen a lot, so just get used to it. So one major JSX at first is kind of annoying because it really slows you down, but it's like a good quality check. Like it keeps you within the lanes too. It also tightens up your own habits, and it ends up being a good thing. I remember when I was doing iOS development 5 years ago. I mean, I still do it now, but like when I only did iOS development, iOS code compiles. It's Objective-C. Back then it was Objective-C, it compiles. So if you make one small mistake, the entire build crashes. And so it forced you to be accurate all the time. Now at that point in my career, I wasn't doing JavaScript. So when I flipped over into JavaScript, where there's like nothing but crash, like even in Xcode, Objective-C, and Swift, you would get pre-compile errors. So if you made a mistake during the code itself will start showing red all over the place. And it'll say, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. So it'll catch you as you make the mistake. It's like spell check on Word, Microsoft Word. So here on JavaScript, at least with Sublime, it's like, hey, whatever goes, right? So it was a very like uncomfortable feeling at first. But JSX kind of keeps you straight as far as that goes. So if you see these if you see this list of events like that, you're good to go. Okay?
Is this like constantly watching thing just part of the Webpack?
Yes. Yes.
So that's the only purpose of Webpack.
No, that's one of many, but it's a very strong reason. The main reason is what we're using it to compile. It takes the strongest reason right now is to compile our ES6 into ES5 code, and also to do what's called bundling. It enables us to import modules into our client-side code, modules that are often reserved for server-side code. That's a very powerful feature of Webpack. Webpack has many layers. Like Webpack on its own is I can do an entire course just on Webpack. So so here, if you have this, we're good to go. Going back to our home component, if you've done a lot of just regular sort of web development programming by now, or server-related programming, you probably have an intuition that this should come from some sort of data feed, right? These events. So we're going to create that data feed. So right now, we're going to create it inside what's called state. So every component in React can store data in one of 2 places: state and props. Props is for properties. So state and props are the 2 places where you store data within a React application. There are cases where you use one, cases where you use another, and we'll kind of go through that right now. So right now, we're going to use state. Okay, so we're going to set up the state. And state is just a JSON object. It's regular, just JavaScript, JSON, pretty standard stuff. And inside the state is where we can store the data for the component. So we can store an array here, just a simple array called events, right? And just make it an array. And within our unordered list, we're basically defining the schema, right? We have a title, a date, and a description, right? So we need a JSON object with at least those three keys, those three attributes. So let's create a JSON object with a title, except spell it right, a date, right, a date, and a description. And right now we have 3 events, so I'm just going to do copy paste 3 times. And then let's just get these thrown over into the array. So November 1. Okay, I would imagine this is pretty self-explanatory, right? Just JSON objects with key value pairs, right? So really what we want to do is we want to render our UI from that array rather than hard coding it inside the actual JSX. That's really how this should happen, right? So we're going to do that next. So if you look at it visually, I guess, like you see how this block of code is what gets repeated. So we want to repeat that block for every element of the array. Okay, so we use the map function for that. Okay, so over here, we set up a curly brace and then this state events map. And then we iterate through. And then we return. And then we copy and paste one of these li tags. Okay, kind of a lot going on here, but it's really not that complicated once you break it down. First things first, on line 22, you see where I open the curly brace and then I close it on line 32? Anything within those curly braces is basically a JavaScript section. So you can just go back to just regular JavaScript in there. And that's why this state events, like that's an array, a map is a JavaScript function, and then we're just looping through. So that's how you read that curly brace, and that's a JSX thing. So if you ever need to break into just regular JavaScript inside your template, your component, I should say, that's how you do it. Yeah, and that happens a lot. Okay. The map function just means go through each element of an array and do the following. And then here we're just returning this chunk, this little piece of HTML or JSX. Okay. Now within that chunk of HTML/JSX, we want to render the data that's relevant to the specific event, not just hard-coded, obviously. So we have an event parameter right here because we're looping through that events array, and we can go in here and replace the contents like so. Whoops, not the description, the date, excuse me. And now you can see how you can loop through an array rather than just do the same thing 3 times. I would imagine the syntax here is intuitive enough. And you want to get in the habit of checking your development window. You see how it's like we add a bunch more? You see that? Because I've been pressing save along the way. And the fact that I don't see any more red means so far so good. So you want to get in the habit of doing that, because if you make a mistake and you don't like check this early enough, you may have made a mistake like a half hour ago, and then that really like is hard to track down, right? So you go back here. Now I left the previous code in there for a reason, so I can confirm visually that both are showing up, right? That means the map stuff certainly worked. There's no other way this would be happening. Good. Okay. All right. So now let's get rid of the previous code. So now this is starting to look more like how our React component should. An important thing to be aware of is in this particular component, the home component, is that we are storing inside the state the actual data that should be eventually rendered. That's inside the state of the home component. That's a very special responsibility. Not all components do that. Okay, so what this component is doing here is it's taking on, assuming a special responsibility that only certain components do. Those are called container components, okay? So container components, they do what they sound like. They contain data, and then they render that data down here. And that it's a special type of component, which we have now constructed in this case. So the home component is now a bona fide container component, okay? Which means what's the other kind of component? Well, then the other kind is oftentimes referred to as a presentational component or sometimes just a view component. A view component or a presentational component, same thing. Its only job is to render data. It's just meant to show stuff. That's it, hence the name, right? A presentational component is where the props comes in. It receives a series of properties from the container and then renders those properties. So this is still really not complying with best practice yet. Can anyone here see where the presentational component would be? Index here. Oh, I see where you're getting that notion. Yeah, and you're not far off. It's not, your intuition is correct, but the index is essentially done. The index is a different kind of component. It's like, this is just where we mount the code and that's it. So we're pretty much done with the index for the duration of this project. So the index is like a very special component. It's like, this is where we mount the code and that's it. So within the home component, I mean, it's on the screen, where do you think the presentation component would be? Yeah, Don, Derek.
The list.
Yeah, give me the actual line numbers.
23.
23, right. So this chunk of HTML code right here, it's doing what I articulated a few minutes ago, right? It's just rendering data. That should be a presentational component. Does that make sense? And even more specifically, it should be really this right here, the div. So 25 to 28. That should be its own component, whose only job is to render the data of a specific event. That's how it should be organized. So let's create that component. What should we call it? Event, yeah, event.js. Let's go ahead and do that. So we head over to the components directory. I'm going to turn off the dev flag. So head over to the components directory. And let's create an event component. And then don't forget to go back to the, now you may be asking, why did I turn off the dev flag? Because whenever I add a new component, I just do that because the watcher is only watching files that existed when you ran it. So by adding a new one, it's not watching it. Does that make sense? So that may have since changed since Webpack 4 was released, but this takes literally a couple seconds, so it's not a big deal. All right, so now let's go ahead to our components, and let's set this guy up. So we import React and all that stuff like we did before. So we just set up the component structure, class, event. It's just the same thing, right? So we can just sort of reuse what we did before. Render, return. This is the event component. Export. I always just start this way just to make sure like it visually works. And then once I confirm that, I start hammering in all the data. So in this case, we're not going to use state, right? We're going to use props. Because remember, presentational components, by and large, should show their data through props. That's how it should work. So if you're using a lot of state in your presentational components, something's off. You're doing something wrong. You need to rethink your process. And conversely, if you're using a lot of props inside your container components, something is off there. Like you need to reconsider your architecture. There's probably a better way. Because that's part of the challenge of setting up a Redux well, there's no Redux yet. A React project is understanding how to organize that in such a way, in that fashion. Okay. So let's go ahead and try this guy out. So inside our home, everyone have this? Thanks, Derek. How did that build? I don't know, but I do need to close it. You're right. So okay, so let's go ahead and import this guy inside the home component. Oh, it didn't. Now I remember. It's because I didn't import it. I didn't use it anywhere, so it didn't compile it. That's why. Okay. Turbo dev server. Now inside here, right, we no longer want to use this. We want to use the event component, specifically inside the li tag. So we want to do that, and then event, and that. That's it. And that's how it should be. That's the proper structure of a React code base. Now remember, the event component is hard-coded, so we should see the same thing 3 times, hopefully. So if I reload that, good. You guys see that? Getting this work, Derek? Got this work? Henry, you good?
Yeah.
Take your time. I've gotten a lot of requests on YouTube to pause when I'm waiting on people, so I'm just going to be getting back to this. Okay, where were we? So we rendered our event presentational components, right? And so far we have just a single line of HTML, right? So once you've confirmed that, now let's fill this guy out. So if I go back here and grab what used to be here, that's really what should be rendered inside the event component, right? So let's copy that and throw that over in here. Does that, you guys see what I did? I just moved one chunk of HTML to another. Okay, but this is going to crash because we're referencing an event property that doesn't exist, right? So let's fix that right now. If we go back to the home container, now here is where properties comes in. We can pass to that presentational component a property called event, which will be that event right there. Okay, now this naming convention is confusing, so I'm going to change this to current event. So the event component has a property called current event. That makes sense? Which we can now reference inside the event component. So if I go to my event component, I can now grab that from the props. Oh, event is a keyword? No, let's do current event. I'm in the wrong spot. I'm sorry. Inside the render, that's why I was giving it. The colorization was off, so I was wondering why I was doing that. This props current event. And then don't forget to update the references down here. Hopefully that, I didn't go too fast on that. So this is the most important part right there, line 6, specifically the right-hand side. This .props.current event. I'm referencing a property called current event, which I assigned in the home container. If you recall, in the home container, I said current event equals event. So I'm now referencing that property right there. And it's the same JSON object from the array, right? So you just reference the characters, the attributes from the JSON object. And that should bring us back to where we were before. Now I'm going to check my Webpack. Webpack is not complaining, so we're good. And then now we can reload the UI. And now we're back to where we were before. But now having done so in a much more compliant fashion with React best practices. So the important thing to understand here, you know, a step beyond the mechanics of React, like what's props, what's state, things like that. That's important, obviously. But at least as important is how to use these situations. When do you use state? When do you use props? When do you, how do you decide what data is which, right? And that's where the architectural decisions can really, you know, cause a code base to become accrue a lot of technical debt, or be very lean and very modular. And that's really the more important part, like understanding when to do what, not like what's a prop, what's a state. Again, obviously that's important. But for the most part, people grasp that relatively quickly. It's understanding when to do what. So where was I? Okay, so we should be back to normal here. Now, just to be like really sure about it, let's add one more event in the array and just make sure it shows up, right? So if we go back to the home container, let's grab one of these JSON objects. Don't forget that comma right there. Basketball game. I spelled November wrong, jeez. I can't wait for Georgetown Hoyas basketball to start. That's like one of the reasons I moved here. You can watch Hoyas games for like 15 bucks. Hoyas take on the Nova Wildcats. Are Georgetown basketball games like hard to get tickets to? Is that like a difficult thing? It's a tough. Yeah, the Nova game is going to be sold out, right?
I don't know. It seemed like there were a lot of seats last year.
Yeah, well, they're the national champion, right? So, yeah, I'm a huge sports guy. So that was back in New York. Like getting to MSG is impossible. It's like $100 to watch like college basketball. It's not worth it. I'm not gonna watch a bunch of 19-year-olds for $100. But I will do that for like Villanova versus UNC or Georgetown. All right. So that worked. Everyone see how that comes together?
You have warnings and possible I still have warnings.
Yeah, yeah. I was sort of conveniently glossing over that. So okay, so the warning that Mr. Undine was referring to right here in the console, right? It says unique key prop. So what that means is in here in this iteration, line 24 of the home.js, when you iterate through an array, when you map through an array, every enclosing element inside the array has to have a key property. It won't crash, so it'll just give you a warning. Now that key property has to be unique. So if I go back up to the actual array elements, I usually give it an ID like that. I'll explain why once we get this through. There is a reason. It's just very opaque, especially at the beginner stages. But I'll explain it because that's why we're here. So whenever you're mapping through an array inside of a container or in any context, you have to pass through a key property like that. Otherwise, you get a warning. You won't crash. You just get a warning. So now, if I rerun this, that should have resolved.
Oh, can I see that again?
Yep, sure. And here I'm kind of showing the array and the key passing, so you can kind of see both sides. Now, the reason that is because in React, what we're building right here is a client-side rendered application. Does anyone not know what that means? Okay, so if you look at the actual source code, so we have HTML here, right? Pretty obvious. But if you look at the actual source code, you do not see that HTML. You see something else entirely. You see very little of anything. That's because the actual rendering doesn't happen until the page loads. The page loads, and then the render happens. That's called client-side rendering, okay? Now, one of the most powerful features of React, in fact, probably the decisive feature which made React kick Angular off the top of the totem pole, was what's called server-side rendering, where you can create your React components on the server and then render them on your browser before the page loads. That's called server-side rendering. If you look at my actual website, again, this is all React, right? But look at the actual source code. You're going to see a huge ton of HTML. How is that happening? Because I'm rendering all this stuff server-side. Now, in order for this to effectively work, the server-side rendered code and the client-side rendered code has to be exactly the same. Otherwise, it just won't work. It'll break. So what React does behind the scenes is it uses this ID prop anytime you iterate through a loop, anytime you loop through anything, and it matches up the ID property on the server-side component rendered with the client-side rendering of the component, and they have to match. And if they don't match, that's how it determines whether or not something is off. Does that make sense? This is also kind of why I try to just gloss over, because like it's not immediately obvious what's going on. But for now, it's good enough just to remember every time you iterate through an array, you have to pass in a key. Like for now, that's good enough. Yeah.
What's the advantage of loading on the server side?
Excellent question. So when you're doing client-side rendering here, it's more of a business decision than a coding decision. But when you do client-side rendering here, notice how there's like no HTML, right? It's just nothing or almost nothing. So when you deploy this site onto the internet and you get people using it, whatever, eventually Google is going to pick up on that and then crawl your website. And that's how Google determines what pages should be ranked higher than other pages. And it crawls your site. It reads the contents of your website and determines what your website is all about. And that's called SEO, right? And if your site has a lot of certain SEO key phrases and keywords, then it'll rank you higher for those words on search results if those keywords are there, which right here they're not. So when Google crawls this page, Google's thinking there's nothing there. But in reality, there's all this Hoya events stuff. So let's say we want to take this to the next level and we want to make a startup out of this, whatever, right? Theoretically, we're going to want to optimize this for SEO for probably a search phrase like Hoya events, Georgetown Hoya's events, Georgetown, like we want to optimize for all those keywords. That's SEO 101. You should be doing that. If you don't have server-side rendering, it's not even an option. So you have to server-side render your code so that you can do that. It's more of a business decision. But a very, very, very important one at that. It's not like a trivial one. So going back to this, we got that working now, right? And our container is now sort of shrinking. Like remember how much code there was before? And now it's kind of shrinking down. Like that's what containers should be. They should be relatively light. Okay. The container is more about what the responsibility is. Like what is the container doing? Okay. And then here we have our presentation component doing what it sounds like. It's presenting the data, right? Now remember what I said before. Presentation components, they're not supposed to use state. They really shouldn't. You can, you just really shouldn't. So for that reason, we want to use what's called a stateless component to do all this, because here I'm setting this up as if it's going to use state. So I'm going to reorganize this a little bit. I'm going to do const event Okay, so I reorganized this component to now be what's called a stateless component, and I don't have to add this right here. And when at all possible, all of your presentation components should be like this. In other words, fundamentally the simplest version of a component you can conceivably make. And that's what presentation components are supposed to be. Another sort of terminology, slang terminology for this is presentation components are often called dumb components, and container components are often called smart components. Smart components referring to the fact that the containers have the data, it has the brains. And the dumb components just take what's given and shows it, and that's it. And so now this is even closer to like best practices, good architecture. There's a couple other things, it's not really worth getting into. It's more detail oriented, but this is more about how you want to think about your data, how to pass things back and forth. Okay, and let's just make sure I didn't break anything. Okay, and then I want to do one last thing before we call it a wrap. Sure, so the difference is mostly syntactic. So it seems like, why bother? But the other one that we had the class setup, class event extends component. That we're creating an entire class, which has a series of properties and functions and state, and even though we're not using them, they're still there. So it's sort of an optimization. Here, we're not creating a class. We're just exporting a function. This is nothing more than a function. So oftentimes, it's called a stateless functional component, and stateless component for short. It's a sort of an optimization. So when you compile it, this just takes up less code, to be honest, less room. So, and that's really what you want to do. Because in a React code base, don't forget, you know, for me, typically, I'm going to have like 200 components. So like you want to keep it lean, you know, like you don't want to have messy components all over the place, because then your build gets really big and bloated. And, you know, that's a problem for obvious reasons. Yeah.
So this is like an event function. What is like the equals in like the right arrow?
Yeah, that's the ES6 notation. So this is how you notate a function in ES6 versus ES5. So another way I could have done this is I could do const event, and this is the old school ES5 notation. This might look a little bit more familiar. Stuff, right? That's like, well, this is even more old school. Like that's like ES5 old school JavaScript that's been around for a decade, right? Starting on line 8, that's how it is today. So you want to learn the ES6 version instead of the ES5 version. That's also one way I determine when I'm interviewing junior devs. I kind of see how up to date they are based on that. So I say things like, you know, like I did this last week. I asked the junior dev, I said, can you just write me a quick array that iterates through this list and just spits out each word? An extremely simple task, just console log each one. I'm not testing his ability to do the problem, because like anyone can do that. I'm testing his notation. And then I then gauge whether or not he's up to date. Does that make sense? And then I can quickly see, oh, he's still on ES5, depending on this person's level. So if I'm talking like a college freshman, I don't make a big deal out of it. I'm talking like a 30-year-old, I'm like, come on, you gotta get better. Like you gotta pick it up, right? So that's how I make these sort of decisions, right? So if you understand line 3, then line 8's the same. Different note, same thing, different notation. Okay, so going back to, where was I? Okay, so the last thing I was going to do, so here, line 9, and the whole array within line 9. That's the JSON data that we're rendering inside the container, and that goes to the presentation components, right? Pretty straightforward. Where do you suppose that data would normally come from? An API, a server, exactly. So let's take this data. Don't forget this. The CLI that we're using gives you a Node and React code base out of the gate. Let's use them both, right? So let's take that data and throw it over to the Node side, the server side, and spit out some API data and then use that instead. Okay? So if we go back, so normally what I do when I switch context, now I'm going to the backend side, the server side. We're no longer programming React now. We're doing Node Express. I tend to like shut down my React code, and then I open up my server code, right? So what we're going to do is inside the index.js of the routes directory. So this is where the home page is being rendered, right? Here's where the index is showing up. I'm going to get rid of these sample routes because they're just samples. And then I'm going to create a new, what's called an endpoint. I'm going to connect the path to events. I think you guys can see where this is headed. And then rec, res. And then for now, I'm just going to render some static JSON with a success key. And then data. And then this is the events data, like that. Oh, I'm sorry, events. So line 13 should be events. Now this route file is already connected, so we can just go ahead and test it like right now. So if we just head over to localhost 3000 and just do events, there it is. Good? Oh, I'm using a Chrome plugin, by the way. JSON formatter, Chrome plugin. Chrome. This guy right here, just if you don't see it the way I do, I'm using that plugin. And I just get some JSON data. So now what we want to do is take the events out of the container, right? Because they shouldn't be hard-coded in the container, right? And we should throw them onto the server right here. That's how, it's a typical architecture. So let's do that. So let's head back to our home component. Let's just grab the array. So I just copied the array, right? And I'm going to throw that in here. I want to make it a little easier to see. So I'm going to do const events like that. And then throw the events in here. I'm just moving chunks of code around, right? We're just moving from point A to point B. So, I didn't like change anything. I just moved it around. And don't forget line 21, where I send the events back. What we're now doing, I think I would say officially qualifies as full stack development. We are now doing back-end coding, and then we're connecting that with the front-end coding. When I went full stack, right around 2014 or so of my career, that was the single best decision I ever made. Because then my clients didn't have to hire me for client side and somebody else for back-end. They just hired me for both. And it like quadrupled my opportunities pretty much within a few months. So simply, the more you can do, the better. That's really all it boils down to. So front end, back end, don't be that guy who's just like, I'm only a back end dev. All right, well then we'll hire the full stack guy, right? Or girl, you want to be as useful to your company or your client as you possibly can. So I've taken that a step further in the past 12 to 18 months where I like swallowed up the DevOps stuff, so like AWS and Google Cloud, Docker containerizations and Kubernetes and all that stuff. Like I started doing a lot of that. Because you got to constantly learn, or you should try at least. So now if I hit the endpoint, we have our events. You guys see that? You guys seeing the same thing? And that's going to serve as our API for now. Okay, obviously it's hard coded, but it's getting closer and closer to a traditional REST API structure. So if we go back to our home component, let's strip out this events array and just leave an empty array behind. Which means when I load the home page, we should be back to an empty UI. Because we removed the data, right? So evidently what we've got to do next is request the data from our API, download it, and then render it. And that's how we're going to finish out the night. Good? So every React component has what's called lifecycle methods, which are a series of functions or methods that you can override at key points of the component lifecycle. Those points are typically on creation, right before it shows up, that's called component will mount. Right after it shows up, component did mount. Right before it's going to get destroyed, component will unmount, so forth and so on. So we're going to pick one of those lifecycle methods. In this case, it will be component did mount. Again, to reiterate, this is a method override. So we don't call this function. The system calls the function at certain points of the component lifecycle. And just to really emphasize that point, if I do console log, without doing anything at all, without ever invoking that function, we're going to see it happen, right? We should at least. So if I open up the console, you should see that. So the system called that function. In fact, you should never call that. Like if you're calling a lifecycle method, something's way off. That should never happen. Like you should use them at the appropriate times. So right here is where we want to make the request for the data from our server. Good? So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to use a library to make API requests. So I'm going to turn off both for now. So I'm going to install a new library. So npm install super agent. That's a request library. And then we're going to do -- save. I'm a fan of super agent, but this is probably one of the few things where I'm a little bit out of the norm. Most people use what's called Axios or just fetch. I just like super agent. I'm just very, very comfortable with the APIs on super agent. So, but another library that's very, very popular is Axios. So whatever, they all kind of work the same. So I'm going to turn the server back on and then run the dev script again. So now here, I'm going to import the super agent library. And Henry, this goes back to what you were asking earlier. Like what are the chief uses of Webpack? Well, right here, we're really taking advantage of Webpack. Super agent is normally used on the back end. It's a server-side module, an NPM module typically used on the server. But we are now bundling it with Webpack to use on the client side. And Webpack helps us do that. There were a couple other bundlers that help you do that. Another one is called Rollup. I forget what the other one is called, but Webpack kind of won that war. Like Webpack took over that. So here, we're going to make a request using super agent, a GET request, to our events endpoint, right? That's our backend endpoint. All right, don't worry too much about these but we're just going to pass in some default values. Line 19 is worth pointing out. Basically, we're telling the request handler to expect a JSON response. So even without line 19, this will work, but this is just best practice. So, and then line 20 is all that really matters. That's the callback, the completion handler. So we pass in a function here, and we do error and data. If error, then alert. Oops. All right, so the way super agent works is that upon a successful response, in this case it's data on line 20, on line 26, that data, the actual payload is packaged inside the body key. That's for JSON responses. For any other type, it's usually .text. So right now we're just console logging, right? So we just want to keep the console open to see if we're getting that data back from the server. Okay, so let's try that guy. You guys see that? Coming from the server? Good. So make sure you have that. So now we are successfully making requests to our backend, right? Our quote-unquote API for now. So once we've confirmed that, now we got to do stuff with the data, right? So let's go ahead and grab that data. So if we look inside this payload, it's inside the data key. So my naming is a little bit off here. It's going to be data.data, but whatever. For now, it's good. The const current events equals or data.body.data. I'm just going to make sure my parsing is correct. So I'm just going to console log that because oftentimes I make a small mistake here and no need for that. All right, current events. And this is our current array of events from the server, right? So what we want to do is take the data from line 27 and put it inside the events array on line 10. That's the goal, right? And that's the last step here. Now this, it's kind of ironic that we're doing this at the last part of the demo, but this is the most important thing I'm going to show you tonight, is how to change the state. Now, it's not hard to do. It's not a hard thing, but conceptually, it's the most important thing about React. Whenever you change state, that will trigger a re-render on the component, right? So you don't have to call re-render. You don't have to call reload, nothing like that. All you have to do is change the state, and the component will automatically reload. Does that make sense? That is the fundamental purpose of state within a React project. It's also why it's called React, because components react to changes in state. And that's where the name comes from. So if I take this current events, we do set state, pass in the JSON object, and then we reset the event array. You see that? And line 29 is probably the most important line of this entire workshop. That will trigger the re-render. Is that clear? So if we reload, watch what happens. We're going to get component mount, the array, and then the data will show up. You see that? And now it's coming from the server. So now it's even closer to like a real world type project. Now it's getting pretty close to what I do for a living. Not quite there, but it's getting closer and closer. We're moving closer to like a realistic scenario. And just to really like illustrate this point, if I do a, if I delay the set state, I'm going to delay the set state for an entire second. So here I'm running a delay, right? So we get the data, and then for 1 second, nothing should happen, and then it should reload. Did you see that? We'll do it one more time, because I kind of went fast on that.
I'm still getting the
Which one?
just my message.
Oh, right here. Okay, then chances are, I mean, any number of things can happen, but the most common mistakes are that your endpoint is pointing to the wrong thing, or you set up one of these parameters incorrectly. What was the mistake?
Yeah, I called it events instead.
Yeah, typical stuff like that. Yeah. So, but you got the data rendering? Excellent, great, that's good. I mean, usually when I do this kind of demo, most people don't get this far, so that's good. Also, going back to Henry, another question Henry had earlier, he asked, what are the benefits of server-side rendering? And I pointed out the most important one, right, that the SEO benefits. But this also points to another benefit of server-side rendering. If you think about it, we're doing two things. We're loading the page, and then we're making a follow-up request, and then we're loading more data. Just by virtue, every single request is doubled, right? We need the load and then the follow-up. Make sense? So you're automatically doubling your server work, right? So, I mean, for now, it's not a big deal. We only have single-digit requests. But what if you had 10 million users, right? You're doubling your server capacity. You're doubling the amount of work your server needs to do. And so what you can do is inside the routes, really what you want to do is have this stuff set on the server and then render that stuff on the server before it hits the browser, thereby wiping away a huge amount of duplicate requests, right? That way, if you hit scale, you're doing your company a big favor by saving a lot of money on scaling more servers and whatnot. That's another important reason for the server-side rendering. Okay. So yeah, I mean, this is as much as I planned on doing. It's been about an hour and a half, so I think we're good. We're good to go for tonight. But before I wrap up the video and all that stuff, I'm going to post this on my YouTube channel. Does anyone have any questions that they want to have answered on the video? No, we're good. Okay, great. I do plan on doing more of these workshops and these demos. I would like to do, at least a couple a month, 2 or 3 a month. So if you guys are interested in that, I think, where's the sign-up sheet? Please make sure you put your name on that if you're interested in follow-up demos like this. I'm thinking about renting my own space right on Wisconsin if you guys if it's hard to get things going together here. So I'll let you know if that happens. Again, to be clear, sort of my long-term game in this, the reason I'm happy to do this, for free, whatever, is because I want to find people who are interested in working in this industry, who want to do what I do for a living, and over the long term, find a good pool of people who would be interested in doing this sort of thing, so I can have a resource to lean on for my clients. Because the one thing I've learned about technology, other than you have to constantly be learning new things, is that there's never enough people. I'm in a perpetual state of I need to hire developers. And that has never not been the case for about the past 5 years. I am always hiring. So, or to put more accurately, my clients are always hiring. And if I don't have a solution right away, it puts everyone in a tough spot. And so part of that process is I need to build up sort of a recurring base of people who enjoy this and who find this interesting. And that's the idea. That's why I'm doing this. Okay. So thanks for coming tonight. I'm going to put all this on YouTube. I'll send everyone an email once that's up. So if you have any questions, yeah.
What are the next workshops?
Oh, yeah, good question. Thanks. So next week we have a React Native workshop, which is going to be basically a lot of this within the context of a mobile application. So we can do all of this within an iPhone application. That's done through React Native. which is extremely powerful. React Native is even more in demand than just regular React Redux. So this is very high in demand, but React Native adds another layer on top of that. And then after that, I'm doing just a general purpose demo about like how to work with startups, the challenges I've faced, how I've dealt with them, how I currently deal with certain situations, like right now, one of my clients is like constantly like, hey, do you know any more devs? Like, can you hire? And things like that. How do I deal with that? How do I deal with very vague specifications, which is just I always get very vague specs, things like that. And whether or not, this sort of thing is for you, right? So I do a lot of contract work. I don't have a full-time boss. I don't work for a company full-time. And whether or not like that lifestyle fits what you're looking for, right? Maybe that's not the right move for you. Maybe you're better off working at a Google or Amazon, which would be great. Or maybe you like sort of the nomadic lifestyle where I can just pick up and move to DC and start here, and like it's fine, like that. Everyone kind of has their own personal preferences, and mostly it boils down to personality and risk tolerance. So those are the important things. So that's the one after that. By then we're probably looking at winter break. So when I come back, either I'll have a space on Wisconsin or we'll do more here, whatever you guys want to do.
And those are all going to be on here.
That would be great. I don't think it's really up to me, but I would love it if it's here. This is a great spot. So, and if you know anyone else, tell your people, tell your friends. Today, we're going to do a quick demonstration of